America remembers Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr. as a titan, a self-made millionaire, a political kingmaker, the patriarch of the most famous dynasty in American history. But behind the polished speeches, the family photographs, and the carefully constructed legend, there exists another version of Joseph Kennedy, one that rarely appears in textbooks. A version whispered about in sealed court records, hinted at in forgotten FBI files, and referenced quietly by historians who found patterns they couldn't ignore. This is not a story about a single crime. It is a story about power. Because when men become powerful enough, the rules that apply to everyone else quietly stop applying to them. Joseph Kennedy was born in 1888 in Boston to a politically connected Irish Catholic family. From an early age, he learned a simple lesson: power protects itself. By his 30s, he had built enormous wealth through banking, stock trading, real estate, Hollywood studios, and liquor distribution. When Prohibition ended, Kennedy positioned himself to profit instantly. His financial instincts were ruthless and often morally flexible, but money was never his ultimate goal. Control was. Kennedy believed the world was divided into two types of people: those who command, and those who are commanded, and he intended his bloodline to command. He carefully engineered the futures of his children like chess pieces. One son would be a war hero, one would become president, one would become attorney general, one would control political fundraising. The family brand had to remain spotless. But in the shadows of that spotless image existed a private world that very few people were allowed to see. Joseph Kennedy spent enormous amounts of time among the ultra-wealthy elite. European aristocrats, Hollywood producers, intelligence operatives, and international financiers. These circles were notoriously secretive and often operated by their own moral codes. Private clubs, private yachts, private estates, places where money erased consequences. Several biographers have documented that Kennedy was openly promiscuous and frequently pursued extremely young women. This alone does not prove criminal behavior, but it establishes a pattern of obsession with control, youth, and secrecy. Some former associates later hinted that Kennedy was not merely indulging personal vices. He was participating in something much larger. During the 1930s and 1940s, federal investigators quietly tracked organized crime syndicates that catered specifically to powerful clients, networks that trafficked underage girls, provided blackmail material, and ensured silence through fear and money. These networks rarely resembled street-level criminal gangs. They were run like corporations. The clients included politicians, media executives, bankers, foreign diplomats. And according to multiple intelligence sources cited decades later, prominent American elites appeared repeatedly in confidential reports. Among those names, Joseph Kennedy's appeared more than once, not in public court filings, not in indictments, but in internal memos, the kind never meant for public eyes. The problem wasn't lack of evidence. The problem was that prosecuting a man like Joseph Kennedy would have meant detonating the entire political establishment. Kennedy didn't simply fund campaigns. He financed movements. He held compromat, damaging information, on powerful figures, and powerful figures held damaging information on him. It created a mutual hostage situation. No one talked. During his tenure as U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, Kennedy cultivated relationships with European elites whose reputations were already questionable. Some had long been rumored to participate in private sexual societies that involved minors. Again, rumors. But consistent rumors across continents and decades begin to form patterns. Patterns that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Behind closed doors, Joseph Kennedy reportedly bragged about fixing problems for friends. Girls who disappeared quietly, families paid to stay silent, police reports that never advanced. In public, he was a devoted Catholic father. In private, he was allegedly something very different, And here is where the story becomes even darker. Because evidence suggests Kennedy may not have merely consumed these services, he may have helped facilitate them, not as a street-level trafficker, but as a broker, a connector, a man who introduced powerful men to other powerful men, inside environments where anything was possible and nothing was documented. If true, this would place Joseph Kennedy at the center of an elite exploitation ecosystem decades before the world ever heard the name Jeffrey Epstein, an earlier generation's version of the same model. And just like Epstein, protection came from intelligence agencies, compromised politicians, and wealthy patrons who feared exposure. By the time Joseph Kennedy suffered a debilitating stroke in 1961, his public image was permanently frozen in amber, the proud father of America's new president. But his private world did not disappear. It was inherited, because secrets, when buried deep enough, don't die. They metastasize. And in the next chapter, we explore how the Kennedy family's rise to ultimate power coincided with an unprecedented expansion of federal surveillance, and what intelligence agencies may have known about their most famous political dynasty. Power does not survive on morality. Power survives on leverage. By the mid-20th century, American intelligence agencies had fully embraced a brutal truth. Blackmail is more effective than loyalty. If you control someone's darkest secret, you don't need to convince them to cooperate. They have no choice. During World War II and the early Cold War, U.S. intelligence agencies quietly partnered with organized crime networks to accomplish strategic goals. Mobsters provided access to ports. Smugglers provided covert logistics. Traffickers provided influence operations. In exchange, law enforcement pressure eased. Files were buried. Prosecutions stalled. This created a dangerous ecosystem where criminal networks and intelligence operations became entangled. Joseph Kennedy understood this world intimately. He moved comfortably between politicians, spies, bankers, and criminals. He didn't ask questions. He traded favors. According to several declassified intelligence summaries, certain elite sexual exploitation networks were tolerated because they produced compromise on foreign and domestic leaders. Photographs, audio recordings, witness statements, material so devastating it could destroy careers instantly. Once compromised, targets were permanently controllable. If a figure like Joseph Kennedy participated in such circles, it would explain something historians have long struggled to understand. Why scandal never stuck to him. There were whispers about affairs, whispers about coercion, whispers about hush payments, yet nothing ever reached court, nothing ever gained traction. Journalists who pursued these stories reportedly encountered intense pressure. Editors killed pieces. Sources retracted statements. Careers stalled. It mirrored patterns later seen in other elite scandals. A key question remains. Did Kennedy merely benefit from this system? Or did he actively help expand it? Some researchers believe Kennedy functioned as a gatekeeper between American political elites and international networks that specialized in discreet entertainment. Luxury properties overseas, private aircraft, yachts in international waters, jurisdictions where law enforcement cooperation was non-existent, places where identities could be erased. If a young girl disappeared in such an environment, there would be no missing person report, no trail, no investigation, and if a witness spoke, they were discredited, paid off, threatened, or worse. The system depended on two pillars: money and fear. The Kennedy fortune provided enormous amounts of the first. Kennedy's political influence supplied the second. By the time John F. Kennedy entered national politics, his father had already built an invisible shield around the family. Opposition research into JFK's personal life routinely vanished. Affairs were ignored. Health issues were concealed. The press cooperated because many editors owed favors. Many owners were compromised themselves. This is not to suggest JFK participated in criminal networks, but it does illustrate the environment he inherited, an environment where silence was currency, an environment built by his father. Some former intelligence insiders later claimed that multiple powerful families, including the Kennedys, were considered untouchable assets, not because they were innocent, but because exposing them would collapse too many institutions at once. Think about the implications. If even a fraction of these allegations are true, then the American public has been living inside a carefully curated myth, not just about one family, but about the nature of power itself. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: systems that allow exploitation do not disappear. They evolve. The faces change. The mechanisms remain. The Epstein case shocked the world because it briefly exposed how modern versions of these networks operate. But Epstein did not invent the model. He inherited it from earlier generations, from men who learned that wealth plus political access equals immunity, men like Joseph Kennedy, which raises an even more disturbing question. How many victims never received justice? How many stories were buried before cameras existed? How many lives were destroyed so powerful men could maintain pleasure and control? History rarely presents smoking guns. Instead, it presents patterns. And patterns tell stories that documents alone cannot. Across decades, investigators, journalists, and researchers noticed the same strange phenomenon surrounding Joseph Kennedy and certain elites in his orbit. People who got too close to sensitive information tended to self-destruct. Some died in accidents, some overdosed, some vanished. Others publicly recanted their claims under questionable circumstances. None of this proves guilt, but collectively, it paints an unsettling picture. One former Hollywood assistant in the 1940s reportedly told friends that she had been pressured to entertain wealthy political donors while working for studios partially controlled by Kennedy interests. She later attempted suicide, survived, and then disappeared from public records entirely. A British socialite in the 1930s allegedly told confidants that Kennedy attended private parties where girls who looked no older than 14 were present. She died years later in what was ruled an accidental fall down a staircase. An American journalist researching elite trafficking rings in the 1950s abruptly changed career paths after claiming he had been warned to stop asking questions. Individually, these incidents mean little. Together, they form a repeating pattern. Researchers began comparing these patterns to later confirmed cases like Epstein. The similarities were impossible to ignore: ultra-wealthy facilitator, international properties, access to politicians, whispers about intelligence agency protection, no meaningful consequences for decades. Epstein's Black Book revealed a vast web of names. Imagine how many names existed in similar books decades earlier, books that were never seized, never leaked, never acknowledged. If Joseph Kennedy participated in such systems, it would explain why his influence extended far beyond campaign donations. It would explain why senators returned his calls, why presidents sought his approval, why intelligence chiefs treated him as an equal, not because he was morally upright, but because he was dangerous. Men who hold secrets are feared more than men who hold weapons. Some historians point to Kennedy's obsession with controlling female sexuality within his own family as another red flag. He allegedly authorized invasive medical procedures on his daughter Rosemary after she became sexually rebellious. A lobotomy at age 23, not for medical necessity but to make her compliant. This reveals a mindset: female autonomy was a threat, control was the solution. Now expand that mindset outward, from one daughter to countless unknown girls. The possibility becomes horrifying. Critics argue that there is no definitive proof linking Joseph Kennedy to a pedophile ring. That is true, but definitive proof rarely exists in elite crimes, because elite crimes are designed specifically to leave no paper trail. What does exist are consistent testimonies, intelligence hints, behavioral patterns, and the historical reality that powerful trafficking networks absolutely operated during this period. The question is not whether such networks existed. They did. The question is whether Joseph Kennedy intersected with them, given his proximity to known power brokers, his documented moral flexibility, his unusual level of protection, and the recurring whispers spanning decades. Many researchers believe the answer is yes, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect is this. If these allegations are even partially true, then the Kennedy family's rise to power may have been lubricated by exploitation. Silence purchased with suffering, influence purchased with blackmail. The American presidency built atop unspoken crimes. That doesn't mean JFK was personally involved. It does mean his father may have used profoundly immoral methods to place his son in the Oval Office. And if so, what does that say about the system that allowed it? It says the system does not reward goodness. It rewards effectiveness. No matter the cost. When people ask how such evil can persist across generations, the answer is simple: because it works. It generates leverage. It generates obedience. It generates obedience faster than laws ever could. The tragedy is that victims become footnotes. If they are remembered at all, most are not. Their names lost. Their stories erased. Their pain absorbed into a machine that keeps turning. Joseph Kennedy died in 1969, never questioned under oath about any of this, never investigated publicly, never confronted. He took whatever secrets he had to the grave, but secrets do not stay buried forever. They leak through patterns, through survivors, through historians brave enough to follow uncomfortable evidence, and through moments like Epstein's downfall, which crack open a door just wide enough for us to glimpse how deep the rot truly goes. In Part 4, we explore how modern revelations force us to reevaluate historical power structures, and why the past may be far darker than we were taught. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, many people treated it as an isolated horror, a lone monster, a singular aberration. But those who understood history saw something else, a familiar pattern resurfacing, a wealthy facilitator. Private islands, powerful clients, light sentences, sudden death. Epstein didn't create this model, he inherited it, which forces a disturbing realization: if these networks existed in Epstein's era, and existed in Joseph Kennedy's era, they likely existed continuously in between. Meaning exploitation at elite levels may not be an exception, it may be a tradition, one passed quietly from generation to generation. The faces change, the structure remains. That possibility forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about American history. We are taught that corruption happens at the margins. In reality, corruption often lives at the center, protected, institutionalized, normalized. Joseph Kennedy was never exposed. Epstein was. Why? Some believe Epstein became expendable, that his utility expired, that he lost protection, that internal power struggles sacrificed him. If that's true, then countless others remain shielded, just as Kennedy was. The implication is terrifying. Justice is not blind. Justice is selective. It moves only when power allows it to move. Which means many victims will never receive accountability, not because their suffering didn't matter, but because their abusers mattered more. This is not about demonizing one family. It is about recognizing a system that rewards ruthlessness and punishes vulnerability, a system that still exists, and until people confront it honestly, it will continue producing Epsteins, producing cover-ups, producing destroyed lives. History is not just a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of what societies choose to tolerate. For decades, society tolerated silence. It tolerated whispered rumors. It tolerated powerful men behaving badly. It tolerated because confronting the truth would destabilize everything. But stability built on suffering is not stability. It is rot, and rot always spreads. In the final part, we ask the hardest question of all. What responsibility do we have now, knowing what previous generations ignored. We may never know the full truth about Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr. No courtroom will hear testimony. No jury will deliver a verdict. No confession will emerge. But history does not require certainty to demand reflection. It requires honesty. Honesty about patterns. Honesty about power. Honesty about how easily societies look away when the abuser wears a suit. The allegations surrounding Kennedy may remain unresolved, but they force us to ask larger questions. How many celebrated figures were not what they seemed? How many national myths were built on hidden suffering? How many victims were sacrificed to preserve greatness? These questions are uncomfortable. That's why they are avoided. But avoidance is what allowed exploitation to thrive. The purpose of revisiting stories like this is not to rewrite history out of spite. It is to understand how darkness hides inside prestige, so we can recognize it when it appears again, because it always appears again, in new forms, with new names, until people stop worshiping power and start demanding accountability. Joseph Kennedy's legacy is usually summarized in one sentence: he built a political dynasty. But perhaps a more honest sentence would be, he understood how power truly works. And that understanding may have come at a terrible human cost. The real tragedy is not that monsters exist. It is that systems protect them. The real tragedy is not that victims are harmed. It is that their harm is treated as collateral damage. If there is any lesson in this story, it is this: evil does not announce itself. It dresses in respectability. It smiles for cameras. It shakes hands. It donates to charities. And behind closed doors, it devours the innocent. The question is no longer whether this happens. History has shown that it does. The question is, what will we do with that knowledge? Because the future is watching, just as we are watching the past. And one day, generations will judge us by whether we chose comfort or courage.